February 26, 2008, 5:30 p.m. Across the country, people are wrapping up their workday and heading to their nearest Starbucks, and they find the doors locked. Not at one store, not in one region, every single one of them. All 7,100. Voluntarily, the CEO shut them down, walking away from $6 million in revenue in a single evening, all while his stock sat at $7, down from $39. While the financial crisis was in full swing, while McDonald's and Dunkin' were actively circling. And he did it to retrain baristas on how to make espresso. Welcome to Unstoppable. This episode is about Howard Schultz, one of the most consequential turnaround decisions in American business history, and what it reveals about a specific trap that smart, high-performing operators fall into all the time. Here's the short version of who Schultz is, because the backstory matters for exactly one reason. The company he built wasn't built on a business model. It was built on a conviction. He grew up with nothing. His father was a blue-collar worker with no safety net, no benefits, no margin for error. When Schultz was 7, his father broke his hip and ankle on the job. He had no health insurance, no severance. The family just waited it out. That moment never left him. Decades later, when Schultz built Starbucks, he extended health insurance to part-time workers, gave employees stock, called them partners, not because a consultant told him it was a good retention strategy, because he had made a promise to himself at age 7 that he would build the company his father never got to work for. That was the foundation. That was the incompressible layer. And by 2008, the machine he built had quietly traded it away, one sensible, defensible decision at a time. That's the story. Let me give you the full picture of what Schultz walked into, because you need to feel the weight of this room to understand the decision. When he returned as CEO in January 2008, the stock jumped 8% that day, which tells you everything about how bad the market thought things had gotten for Starbucks. He found 5 fires burning simultaneously. First, a self-inflicted wound. Starbucks had been opening 6 or 7 new stores per day at peak expansion. 6 or 7 per day. The company was targeting 40,000 locations globally. In the race to hit those numbers, stores got opened in the wrong markets, standards slipped, and the experience started to feel like any other chain. Second, the global financial crisis. The worst economic collapse since the Great Depression had arrived, and Starbucks, a $4 coffee in a downturn, was being held up as Exhibit A of unnecessary spending. Bloggers were using Starbucks as shorthand for financial irresponsibility. That's a brand perception problem stacked on top of a financial problem. Third, genuine competition for the first time. McDonald's had launched McCafe. Dunkin' was repositioning aggressively. For years, Starbucks had operated in a category with no credible competitor at scale. Now it had 2. Fourth, internal culture erosion. Standards had become inconsistent. Baristas had been de-skilled by automation. Espresso machines that automated the process so drinks came out faster, but nobody in the store understood the mechanics behind pulling a proper shot. The craft was gone. Fifth, Starbucks had become a symbol. Not the community gathering place Schultz had built, a symbol of the old economy, of excess, of a lifestyle people were embarrassed by. Here is the diagnostic move that separates what Schultz did from what most operators do in this situation. He looked at the 5 fires and said, 4 of them are external, real, but external. 1 of them I caused. And the one I caused is why the other 4 are lethal. He named it directly. Growth had become a carcinogen, not a competitor, not a market cycle, a carcinogen. Something that spread silently through what looked like healthy tissue. And by the time you could see the symptoms, the damage was already systemic. Here's what the disease actually looked like. The espresso machines were automated. Drinks came out faster, resulting in better throughput numbers and labor efficiency, but the craft disappeared. There was a time when you'd watch a barista actually pull a shot, tamp the grounds, time the extraction, steam the milk with technique. It was theater. People paid the premium partly for that theater. Coffee was now pre-ground, pre-packaged in vacuum-sealed bags, more efficient, more consistent, and now the smell of fresh ground coffee beans, one of the most powerful sensory signatures of the Starbucks experience, was eliminated from the store. Hot breakfast sandwiches were added because they drove margin. The problem? They filled the store with the smell of melted cheese and overpowered the coffee aroma entirely. Every one of those decisions had a rational business case, but the accumulation was lethal. Think about how this plays out in a professional services firm. A firm builds its reputation on genuinely difficult, original strategic work. It starts winning retainer clients because recurring revenue is more predictable. It starts staffing retainers with mid-level teams to protect margin. Then it starts solving the same problems repeatedly because that's what the retainer model rewards. 10 years in, the senior partners are managing client relationships, not doing the work. The firm is profitable. The work is fine, but the intellectual product that created the reputation, the thing that justified the premium, had been quietly optimized away. And when a sharper competitor shows up with better thinking and lower costs, the firm has nothing left to defend at the top of the market. That is exactly where Starbucks was. Once you strip out the experience, the only lever is price. And Starbucks had made itself subsuitable at exactly the moment its two biggest competitors arrived with credible products at lower cost. Starbucks had 4 real options. Each one is a version of a choice you faced or will face at the level you operate. Option A, the standard turnaround. This is the playbook every CFO, board advisor, and restructuring consultant would have handed Schultz. Cut costs hard, close underperforming stores, trim labor, protect margin, communicate stability to investors. Rational, defensible, expected. And completely wrong for this specific situation. Because aggressive cost cuts at Starbucks would have done exactly what? Degraded the customer experience further, made the company more substitutable, accelerated the trust erosion that caused the revenue problem in the first place. It would have treated the financial crisis as the disease when the financial crisis was its symptom of a cultural one, treating a structural crack with paint. Option B, the product and marketing offensive. New drinks, promotions, discounting to recover traffic. You could build a credible 90-day plan around this that looked compelling on a board deck. The problem? Traffic wasn't down because the product failed. Traffic was down because the experience had degraded and the premium was no longer justifiable. Buying people back in with a promotion doesn't fix that. It confirms the suspicion that the premium isn't real and trains the customer to wait for the deal. There's a version of this that every operator knows. You're losing a major client. Not because the work got worse, but because the relationship went transactional and they're not sure you still deserve the rate, and someone proposes a discount or a service ad to keep them. It might hold the contract for a quarter, doesn't rebuild the trust. Option C, the gradual cultural reset. Retrain baristas over time, store by store, roll out new standards gradually, minimize disruption, keep the organization stable while signaling a reset. This feels mature, responsible, like good change management. But here's what it doesn't create: a shared before and after moment. The line in the sand that every person in a 135,000 person organization needs to see to believe that the reset is real and not just the next initiative. If you've watched a company try to gradually change its culture for 3 years without it taking hold, you understand exactly what I mean. Gradual change doesn't create organizational belief. It creates a revised version of the same drift with better language around it. Option D, the radical pause. Close all 7,100 stores one evening, 3 hours, absorb the $6 million. Retrain 135,000 baristas simultaneously across the entire country in the same window. On a spreadsheet, this fails every standard business case test. Strategically, it was surgery. February 26, 2008, at 5:30 p.m., the lights went out. Every store in America simultaneously. Baristas gathered inside to relearn the fundamentals: correct grind setting, proper tamp pressure, extraction time, milk technique, standards that had been lost to automation and throughput optimization over years of growth. Revenue costs, approximately $6 million. Competitor response, immediate. Duncan had signs up within hours, analysts called it reckless, the financial press questioned the judgment. Here's what most people missed about that evening. The training was almost beside the point. Barista said afterward that the most powerful part wasn't learning how to pull a better espresso shot. It was the act of stopping. For the first time, every person in the organization, from a new part-timer to a senior director in Seattle, experienced the same message simultaneously. We are not okay with where we are. We are stopping, and we are going back to what made this worth building. The closure was the message. The espresso training was the vehicle. Think about what that looks like at enterprise scale. A transformation leader stands up at a governance review and says, "We're pulling the current implementation and going back to requirements." Not because they're required to, because they've diagnosed that the root cause is upstream, and continuing forward would compound the error. The cost is real, the visibility is high, the delay is uncomfortable. But the signal it sends that this leader has the clarity to name what's wrong and the conviction to stop it is worth more than 6 months of recovered timeline. That leader walks out of that room with more authority than they walked in with. That's what the Starbucks store closure at the level where these decisions actually happen. Schultz paired the closure with moves that matter. He closed 600 underperforming stores with 300 more to follow, not as a cost-cutting measure, as a quality control measure. Stores opened with adequate analysis. He named the error. He killed the hot breakfast sandwiches, significant annual revenue gone, because they violated the sensory signature of the brand. He chose brand integrity over a profitable revenue line. He brought back whole bean grinding in store and launched Pike Place Roast specifically to restore the coffee aroma that had been absent from stores. He gathered 10,000 executives and store managers in New Orleans deliberately, a city that had been destroyed and rebuilt. The symbolism was intentional. He refused to cut partner health benefits or stock participation, even at the bottom of the crisis, because those were the promise, not a perk, the founding promise. And then he did the thing that I think is the most instructive move in this entire case. He stood up publicly and named the cause. The automated machines, the pre-ground coffee, the acceleration that stripped the craft and said, "That's on me. I was chairman during all of it." He didn't blame the recession. He didn't blame the previous CEO, didn't enumerate the competitive headwinds. He named his own decisions. If you sat in a boardroom where a leader is explaining a failed program and watched them spend the first 45 minutes on external headwinds, vendor failings, resourcing gaps, and market conditions without once saying, "Here is specifically what I decided that made this worse," you know exactly how that room responds. People do the math. They know what the leader controlled. Every minute spent on external attribution, the room gets a little colder. Not because the external factors weren't real, but because the leader is signaling that they don't understand or won't say what actually happened. Schultz did the opposite, and the structural effect was immediate. When the leader with the most to lose accepts full responsibility for the cause, the organization stops allocating energy to blame and starts focusing on the fix. Every downstream decision carries weight because the room now trusts that the diagnosis was honest. This is not a humility exercise. This is authority architecture. By the numbers, it worked. Starbucks stock surged 143% in 2009. Net income recovered from approximately $315 million at the crisis low to about $564 million the following fiscal year, nearly double in 12 months. Same-store sales began recovering within 12 months of the turnaround program launch. Over the following decade, the stock delivered roughly 10 times the return from the 2008 lows. But here's the part of the story most people skip, because it's the part that changes the lesson. The company broke again. By 2022, 2023, the same forces were back at work. Mobile ordering, introduced to modernize the customer experience, had created chaos at the bar. Baristas managing simultaneous in-store and digital queues. Wait times climbed, drinks were inconsistent again. The menu had expanded to hundreds of customization combinations. Seating was removed from stores to create throughput. The third place was disappearing. Again. In August 2024, the board fired the CEO, the second one since Schultz, and brought in Brian Niccol, who had engineered Chipotle's recovery from a food safety crisis that nearly destroyed that brand. Starbucks stock surged 24.5% on the announcement alone. Niccol's plan? Back to Starbucks. When Schultz heard the framing, he said he did a cartwheel in his living room. By mid-2026, global comparable sales up 6.2%, ahead of analysts' expectations. North America same-store sales up 7.1%. North American operating income up nearly 30% year over year. The ship is turning again. The question the outcome raises is, if the same forces break the company the same way twice, is the playbook solving the problem? Or is it buying time until the next growth cycle overwhelms the soul? That tension is exactly where the principles live. 3 principles, each one specific. Principle 1, when culture has drifted, you don't need a program, you need a scar. When a system has been quietly eroding through years of accumulated rational decisions, incremental fixes don't move it. They can't, because the people inside the system cannot tell the difference between a real intervention and another initiative that will be forgotten in 2 quarters. New value statements don't move organizations. Reset offsites don't move organizations. A memo from the CEO doesn't move organizations. A scar moves organizations. A visible, costly, irreversible action that creates a shared before and after for everyone in the system simultaneously. The $6 million wasn't a cost. It was a proof payment. Proof that this wasn't another slide deck. Proof that the reset was real and not just language. The principle? When culture has drifted, the action has to be disproportionate to the stated problem. If the action is comfortable, it won't be believed. If it makes someone at the leadership level nervous about whether it was worth it, you're in the right zone. Ask yourself, when was the last time you did something that cost you something real in order to signal what matters? Not a policy, not a statement, an action with a visible, measurable price tag. If you can't think of one, that might be telling you something about why the drift is continuing. Principle 2. Total ownership of the self-inflicted wound is the fastest path to credibility in the room. This is the one I most want operators to actually internalize because it runs directly counter to the instinct. Here's what happens in a boardroom or a steering committee when a leader explains a failure without naming their own decisions as part of the cause. The room doesn't believe the diagnosis. They've heard external attribution before. They know what the leader controlled. Every minute spent on headwinds and market conditions without a single, here's what I decided that actually made this worse, is a minute the room is doing its own calculation, quietly deciding whether this person actually understands what happened or is managing the narrative. A credibility in that room isn't determined by your title. It's determined by whether people believe you're giving them an accurate read of reality, even when it costs you something. Schultz named the automated machines, the pre-ground coffee, the breakfast sandwich decision, his decisions, and the structural effect was immediate. When the person with the most to lose accepts full responsibility, the organization stops allocating energy to blame and focuses on the fix. Every downstream decision now carries weight, because the room trusts the diagnosis was honest. The leader who walks into a difficult governance review and says, the vendor underperformed, the resourcing was insufficient, the timeline was always compressed, is explaining. The leader who says, we made 3 specific decisions in months 2 and 4 that created those conditions. Here they are. Here's what I'm changing, is leading. One of those leaders leaks credibility every time they're in a high-pressure room. The other one builds it. If you don't own the cause, no one trusts the cure. Principle 3. Growth without explicitly protecting the incompressible layer is just self-erosion. Every business and every senior leader have an incompressible layer. The thing that loses its value the moment you optimize it for efficiency or scale. For Starbucks, it was the experience. The sensory ritual. The reason someone paid $4 instead of $1.50. When they compressed that layer, automated the shot, pre-ground the beans, filled the store with cheese smell, they didn't just make the experience slightly worse, they eliminated the moat because the experience was the moat. The trap is that none of the individual decisions looked wrong in isolation. Everyone had a rational case. The automated machine saves 45 seconds per drink. That compounds across millions of transactions to real money. Pre-ground beans are cheaper and more consistent. Breakfast sandwiches improve margin. Every decision, rational. The accumulation, lethal. Starbucks tells the story twice, in 2008 and 2024, because the same compression forces keep winning. Scale pressure, throughput metrics, Quarterly reporting that rewards efficiency. Nobody decides to erode the soul. It happens one sensible decision at a time by people doing exactly what they were asked to do. For every operator listening, identify what in your business model is incompressible, the element that loses its value when optimized, and build explicit protection around it, not in your mission statement, in your operating metrics, in what gets reviewed at the leadership level, in what triggers a conversation when it slips. If it doesn't have explicit protection, scale will erode it through perfectly reasonable decisions made by people who are doing their jobs. Let's bring this to where it actually matters, not inspiration. What do you do with this? If you're a founder or CEO scaling something, the first question is, where have we been optimizing for efficiency at the cost of the thing that clients actually pay a premium for? Not rhetorical. Name it specifically. Where has throughput replaced quality? Where has good enough at scale started winning over exceptional in a way that's hard to replicate? Where did the product become more scalable and less differentiated? Then ask, what is our version of the store closure? The visible, costly, unambiguous action that tells every person inside the company and maybe in your market that the reset is real, not a strategy document, an action with a price tag. Killing a profitable revenue line that's diluting the brand, canceling a product that exists because you can build it, not because it belongs in your company's future. Publicly removing a metric that's driving the wrong behavior, even when it makes your near-term results look worse. The bar, if the action doesn't make someone at the board level feel uncomfortable, it probably won't create the belief you need internally. Now, if you're an executive or senior leader, the Schultz move you need to study most closely is not the store closure, it's the ownership move. Think about your next difficult governance review. The instinct when performance is mixed to compress time on what went wrong and maximize time on the recovery plan. That feels efficient, forward-focused. It's also the fastest way to lose the room. The room already knows something went wrong. What they're evaluating, often without saying it directly, is whether you understand what specifically happened and whether you have the clarity and the integrity to prevent it from recurring. The leader who walks in with a clean, specific account of the decisions that created the problem and owns them without hedging doesn't just survive that review, they come out with more credibility than they walked in with, because they've demonstrated something rare. The willingness to give an accurate read of reality, even when it costs them something in the room. That's exactly what Schultz did. Not just the store closure, the standing up and naming. This is what I decided. It was wrong. Here is what I'm changing. Before your next high-stakes review, write out the specific decisions you made that contributed to the current situation, not the external factors, your decisions. Practice saying them out loud without the hedge at the end. That is the version of the story that builds credibility, not the version that protects you in the moment. For everyone, regardless of your role or level, ask honestly, what is the incompressible layer in what you're building or what you're building your career around? What is the thing that, if you optimize it for convenience or scale or just managing the relentless pressure of the workload, loses the property that makes it worth having? It might be the intellectual depth of your work, the standard you hold yourself to when no one is checking, the quality of your decisions when the timeline is tight, the way you show up for your team when the pressure is highest, the relationship that exists outside the transaction. Then ask, what decisions have I been making, reasonable, defensible decisions, that are quietly eroding it? Schultz didn't wake up and decide to ruin Starbucks. He made a series of sensible choices in service of growth. And one day he looked up and the thing his promise had built was almost unrecognizable. That trajectory is available to anyone operating at sustained high pressure, not through bad decisions, through a long sequence of good ones that accumulate into the wrong destination. The question isn't whether that drift is possible in what you're building. The question is whether you have a mechanism to catch it before it requires a crisis to reverse. Because the leaders who catch it early, who run the diagnostic before forcing function arrives, pay the cost of the pause. The ones who don't pay the cost of crisis. Choose which bill you want. Howard Schultz built a company out of a promise he made to himself at age 7, watching his father with no safety net and no one to catch him. The third place wasn't a brand concept. It was a belief about what a company could be for the people who worked inside it and the people it served. When the machine he built started eating that belief in the name of efficiency, he didn't rationalize it. He didn't manage the narrative. He stopped the machine publicly, expensively, visibly. And he stood up and said, I did this. Here's what I'm changing. This is not a turnaround strategy. This is what leadership actually looks like when it costs something real. Leaders who built things that last and whose credibility compounds over time are not the ones who never make expensive decisions. They're the ones who make them clearly, own them completely, and don't wait for the crisis to force the issue. Schultz had to be forced. The stock hit at $7, the financial crisis, the competitors circling. Those were his forcing function. The question is whether you wait for yours. What in what you're building is drifting right now? Not because anyone decided to let it drift, but because no one has stopped long enough to see it. And what would it cost you to address it before it costs you everything? Understanding this makes you unstoppable.